Judge all you want. It does not support the maintenance of Spanish to criticize another country and that language variety. All it does is create distance, create shame, create frustration, create negativity that at the end of the day does not honor all of the power that is behind the language resistance. Saludos, mi gente. I am Dr. Xiomara Rivera Pagan. This is another session of LUPA Talks, and today I want to focus on language as a form of resistance. The times that we are living in are requiring more resistance than ever because there are systems of power that are trying to manipulate our understanding of reality as well as take advantage of our communities, especially our communities that are coming from diverse language backgrounds or any sort of diversity at all. And so because in this space we focus a lot on language, I really want to convey that we can do some of that resistance work with our language. And so I'm going to give you some examples of how we're already doing it and how we can continue to do it. Let's start with the fact that there is a concept called standard language ideology that reminds us that the concept of a better language than another language is really just an idea, a belief, a concept that is made up often by people in power in order to oppress other people from different language backgrounds or language varieties. Standard language ideology is a bias toward an abstracted, idealized, homogeneous spoken language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions, and which names as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class. This is important for many reasons. Number one, it is, again, an idealized concept. It is not reality. There is no better or worse language. And so it's really important to value linguistic diversity because we want people to feel comfortable expressing themselves and growing in their capacity to continue learning languages, because that's the only way we're going to be able to communicate, feel safe enough to communicate, and then also to increase our proficiency. We don't have a lot of people in power who have a good, solid understanding of how language is practiced, how language is learned, how language evolves, how language works within our society, how language oppresses certain groups or elevates certain groups in order to maintain their power. So that is why it's really important to talk about these systems and to talk about these decisions so that we can then be more aware of them to either push back against them and or outright change them. Some examples of what this looks like, how Spanish is being used in the US. Bad Bunny is about to perform in the Super Bowl, and there are conversations about the legitimacy of him actually performing. That is him showing resistance in terms of him using a language that absolutely has and should take up space. Puerto Rican Spanish. Puerto Rican Spanish often gets this pushback, right, of the legitimacy of the Spanish that is spoken in Puerto Rico. It is a Spanish that has been influenced by colonization and by cross-migration. And so all of that comes together in a Spanish that is very specific to Puerto Rico. But the reality is that the Spanish is specific to every country, every region, every locality. That's not a negative thing unless you make it so. Spanglish is another example of this, where there are individuals who want to limit the use of Spanglish because they're saying you're mixing languages and therefore not honoring one or the other. But the reality is just the opposite. So what is important to consider in these situations? Number one, to always question. Always question when someone is pushing back or giving you a hard time about the language that you're speaking. speaking? Why? Why are they so challenged by the way that you are speaking? How much does it truly affect them? Language is very emotional. People have such innate feelings because over time they have been told that language should or should not be spoken a certain way. They have certain traumas around how they've experienced language. Maybe they've been pushed out of their communities for speaking or not speaking a certain way. So I understand that there's a lot of feelings that go behind our understanding of language, and at the same time, I have studied and I have practiced so that I can speak with confidence and with power in saying that there is no better or worse language, and that to use language thoughtfully, intentionally, is actually a beautiful act of resistance that can empower you to then not only feel more confident in your use of language, but also, as I always say, increase your proficiency in working towards those standard languages. So what we need to consider, always question, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide, and what are their intentions? So when you're in these conversations and someone is pushing back, their intentions might be different from your intentions. And so if you are working towards a particular goal and their goal is to limit your voice, or their goal is to silence you because they want you to perform in the way that they either have or have been told it's appropriate to, who gets to decide? You. You get to decide whether or not their intention and their goal is the same as yours. Because if it's not, it really does not make sense to follow their recommendation. There is no way that I'm going to somebody who has never trained for a marathon to get advice on how I should train for a marathon. People have all sorts of great ideas. And at the end of the day, remember what is best for you. And then also what are best practices for your specific needs and opportunities. I would recommend a place of additive, not subtractive. And what I mean by that is in spaces, especially for language, there's this concept of if you don't know or if it's not right, you shouldn't be doing it at all. All of that does is limit people's opportunities to practice. Use everything that you have. Use all of your skill set. Try and incorporate as much as you can in order to then reach that additional goal. For example, if I'm practicing this with the concept of Spanish in the US, somebody who's trying to tell me that Spanish should not be practiced in the US, what is their goal? What are their intentions? Likely, they're thinking from a fear-based response that if you start speaking Spanish and creating space for Spanish, that will either take away resources from them or they won't understand, and they're worried about how they will experience that. But at the end of the day, it's not in the best interest of the community to limit our languages. It's not in the best interest of those individuals who speak the language of Spanish and are also contributing to our communities by working, by bringing their kids to school, by engaging in the community and supporting the community. It's not in the best interest of any of those individuals to limit their understanding and their capacity because they don't speak English by adding Spanish. It does not take anything away from English to add Spanish. It is that mindset of fear that really comes from a place of, oh no, but what will happen? But if we remind ourselves that adding to does not take away from, then at the end of the day, their goal is not my goal. My goal is to create space for Spanish because I want space for Spanish as well as English, because I think that there are ways that we can move to create more space for more languages and more language diversity that does not take away any opportunities, but instead adds to the opportunities of some of those voices that should be heard and haven't been up until this point. In the term of Puerto Rican Spanish, again, what is somebody who is criticizing Puerto Rican Spanish, what are their goals? Perhaps they're challenged because they want to feel included. Perhaps they're challenged because they, again, have been told that there is a right or a wrong way to speak. Perhaps they are challenged because they have not seen the evolution of language within their culture, their community, their space. But that has nothing to do with Puerto Rican Spanish and its value as an asset. Puerto Rican Spanish is beautiful because it is unique to that particular country, to that particular culture, to our community, to a form of resistance that, despite all of the English influences that have been imposed by colonization that continues in current day, they continue to maintain Spanish as the majority language in that country despite all of that colonization. And the more that you study the history of Puerto Rico, you know, if there was ever a space for language as an act of resistance, it was in Puerto Rico, where that English language was imposed through the government, through the school systems, in the communities. And despite all of that, the resistance of the people, of the students, of the communities, of leaders on and off the island made it so that it still is Spanish as the national language. You can judge all you want. It does not support the maintenance of Spanish to criticize another country and that language variety. All it does is create distance, create shame, create frustration, create negativity that at the end of the day does not honor all of the power that is behind the language resistance that the Puerto Rican people, again, on and off the island, have committed to in an effort to preserve their Spanish language. And then Spanglish. Spanglish is one of those things that across countries, across cultures, there's still a lot of judgment towards. Best case scenario, Spanglish is being judged because there is this fear we will not be able to maintain the Spanish language. Best case scenario, there is a desire to protect the use of Spanish in order to maintain that home language for the culture, for the community, for the connection to our history. And that is absolutely valid. And that is why I always say, I want for us to create space for Spanglish so that we can increase our proficiency in working towards Spanish. There is also a worst case scenario that some people are judging Spanglish because they believe that it is a lesser language. And I've mentioned in other conversations that it is this beautiful skill that is called translanguaging. I've mentioned that it is actually an asset in our brains, that it is helping us access language that we have in our full linguistic repertoire. But at the end of the day, again, we need to come back to who gets to decide what are their intentions and what is my goal. If my goal, whether or not their intentions are to preserve the language in order to maintain it for our culture and our community, or whether their goal is to judge me because they think that I'm speaking incorrectly. Neither of those are my goal. My goal is to use Spanglish as a tool to either increase my proficiency to work towards more Spanish, because I want more Spanish as a heritage speaker. My goal is always to, in certain spaces, push myself so that I can have more fluency, more ability, more ease in spaces where I feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish. And at the same time, there are times where I just want to free flow and speak and express myself most authentically. Spanglish is a part of that. And so if I want to use Spanglish in order to express myself most authentically and most freely, that should be allowed too. And that is a goal of mine, to speak freely, to speak authentically about the things that are important to me. What I find really interesting about those 3 examples that I gave you about Spanish in the US, about Spanish in Puerto Rico, and about Spanglish is that those are the same practices of someone limiting language and limiting expression in order to gain control based on their understanding or based on the system. And it's different versions of the same act, but in each of these, it's different people judging, right? So in the first one of Spanish in the US, it's kind of like the most outsider of the group, the most distinct in terms of a different language. Someone who does not speak Spanish is like, oh my gosh, no, that can't happen. Boom, using Spanish in the US, act of resistance. In the example of Puerto Rican Spanish, yes to Spanish, but no to Spanish like that. Puerto Rican Spanish, boom, act of resistance. Okay, yes, Spanish, but not with English. Again, Spanglish, boom, act of resistance. So you can see how it can happen within our own groups. It can happen within a group that is considered very distinct from what we would feel our culture and our community, but it even happens within our culture and our community. And so we have to remember that, because sometimes even people who care about us, even people who have good intentions, they're not necessarily our intentions. They're not necessarily our goals. And so that's why it's really important that when we're thinking about how we're using language, that we're thinking about how we're using it as an act of resistance in order to express ourselves most freely, most authentically, and work towards our goals. While other folks are trying to use these language judgments in order to silence and in order to shame, consider the way that you are creating space for more language. Coming back to that curiosity, how are we being curious about the language that we are hearing? Because that's another thing. In addition to all of this, we're using language as a resistance in order to present language. But we can also honor language resistance in terms of how when others are speaking, we create space for them to express themselves freely, how we can advocate for them when they are being challenged or put down for speaking. So this week and every week, I encourage you to reflect on how you use language as a form of resistance. Let me know in the chat, how are you thinking about language, either differently because of this conversation, and or how are you actually practicing language as an act of resistance? I would love to hear how you are pushing back against systems in order to express yourself most freely, most authentically. Y nos vemos en la próxima.